She was 21, and she was homeless. And she had exactly one thing left in the world. A single yellowed bone, no longer than her thumb, that she kept in the inside pocket of a coat that had stopped being warm 2 winters ago. No clan, no kin, no copper, no silver, nothing but that bone and the clothes on her green back, and the slow certainty that she was going to die in the mud of a market town that did not know her name and would not have cared if it did. And with that one bone, on a gray morning at the edge of the slave market in the river city of Drenmark, she bought a slave wagon that everyone else had refused to touch. A rotted, rusted, half-collapsed cage on 4 broken wheels that the trader had been trying to give away for a week. The other buyers said it was cursed. The trader said it was junk. But what nobody knew, what nobody had bothered to check in the long months the wagon had sat rusting at the back of the lot, was that beneath the false floor of that ruined cage, in a crawl space barely tall enough for a body, sealed in the dark and the silence, was something still alive. Something that would change everything. Before we go on, if stories like this one mean something to you, take a moment to subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel, across how many borders, into how many homes. Now, let's go back to that grey morning and to the orc girl with one bone to her name. Her name was Vera of the Ashfen Greenskins, though there was no one left alive who called her that anymore. The Ashfen had been a small clan, a river marsh people, never numerous and never important. The kind of clan that the great war bands and the city lords forgot about until the day they were convenient to forget about entirely. They had lived for 9 generations in the fenlands south of the Iron Reaches, in longhouses built on stilts above the black water, fishing the channels and trading dried eel and reed baskets and the strange luminous moss that grew only in their part of the marsh and that the alchemists of the cities paid well for. They were not warriors, the Ashfen. They were not raiders. They were a quiet, watchful, stubborn people who had survived for 9 generations precisely by being too small and too poor and too far out in the trackless marsh to be worth anyone's trouble. That had been their strength. In the end, it had been the thing that killed them. When the slave charters came, the great licensed companies of the river cities, with their iron writs and their paid mercenaries and their legal right granted by the city councils to take unbonded and unclanned greenskins of the wild marshes into service, there had been no warband to defend the Ashfen, and no powerful patron to speak for them, and no treaty that named them as people rather than as resources. The charter companies came in flat-bottomed boats with chains in the hold, and they came at the end of the dry season when the water was low and the channels were passable, and they took the Ashfen the way a man takes fish from a drained pond. Not all at once. That was the thing Vera remembered in the years after, when she let herself remember anything at all. They did not come all at once. They came in seasons. A few longhouses one year, a few more the next. Always the unclanned first, the orphans and the widows, and the ones with no kin to make a noise about their absence. And then, when those were gone, the families, taken one by one until the marsh that had held 9 generations of Ashfen held only silence and stilts and the slow black water moving through the reeds. Vera had been 6 the first time the boats came. She remembered her grandmother pulling her down beneath the floor of the longhouse into the crawl space where the fishing nets were stored and holding a hand over her mouth, and the 2 of them lying in the dark above the black water, listening to the boots and the chains and the voices speaking the hard, clipped river tongue of the cities. They had not been taken that year. Her grandmother had a gift for stillness, for becoming part of the dark, and she had passed it to Vera the way other grandmothers passed down recipes or songs. Be still, be small, be silent. Let them pass over you and not see you. It was the oldest survival the Ashfen knew, and for a while, for a few more seasons, it worked. It did not work forever. By the time Vera was 16, the marsh was nearly empty. Her grandmother was dead. Not taken, just old, just gone the way the old go. In her sleep, in the longhouse, with the moss light glowing soft above her. Her mother was gone too, taken in a winter raid 3 years before, loaded onto a charter boat with 11 others, and pulled away down the channel into the grey. And Vera had watched it happen from the crawl space, and had been still and small and silent, exactly as she'd been taught, and had hated herself for it every day since. With a hatred that had no bottom. Her father she did not remember. There had been brothers once, and they were gone too, scattered to the charters and the chains and the great unmarked map of human cities where greenskins went and did not come back. And then there was the last raid, the one that took everyone else. Vera was 16, and she was strong enough by then, and quick enough, and stubborn enough, that when the boats came up the channel in the last grey light of an autumn evening, she did not go to the crawl space. She ran. She ran out across the reed flats in the falling dark, knee-deep and then waist-deep in the black water, while behind her the longhouses burned. The charters burned what they couldn't carry, always, so that the marsh would have nothing to come back to. And the screams of the last Ashfen went up into a sky already filling with smoke. She ran until she could not run, and then she swam, and then she crawled, and somewhere in the night she came out onto a mud bank far down the marsh, and lay there, shaking. And when the dawn came, she was the last of the Ashfen greenskins, and she was alone, and she was free. And freedom tasted exactly like ash and black water, and the worst kind of grief there is, which is the grief of the one who got away. She was 16, and she had survived, and there was nothing left to survive for. For 5 years after that, Vera moved through the human world the way water moves through cracks, finding the gaps, the overlooked spaces, the places where a clanless orc could exist without quite being seen. She learned the river tongue, which she had half known from her mother. She learned to keep her head down and her tusks filed short, so she looked less like a wild marsh greenskin and more like one of the city-bred orcs who worked the docks and the tanneries and the slaughter yards, the ones the charters left alone because they were already, in every way that mattered, owned. She worked when she could find work. She hauled fish baskets in Lowmore. She scraped hides in the tanning pits of Karsh, a job so foul that even the desperate avoided it, which meant it was always available to someone with no other options. She dug graves in the plague season at Vinter's Cross. She did the work that nobody else would do, in the places nobody else would go. Because the work nobody wanted was the only work she could get. And she had learned, young and hard, to want what other people threw away. Because that was the lesson, wasn't it? That was the lesson the marsh had taught her and the cities had hammered home. Wanting was a privilege. Choosing was a privilege. The luxury of standing in a market and selecting the good fruit, the sound timber, the strong wagon. That belonged to people with options. And Vera had never in her life had options. She had what was left over. She had the scraps. She had the thing at the back of the lot that everyone else had passed by. And she had learned to look at those leftover things not with despair, but with a strange, patient attention. The attention of someone who has had to find value where others see only ruin. Show her a broken thing, and she would find the part that still worked. Show her a thing everyone had given up on, and she would ask the question no one else had bothered to ask. But is it actually dead? Or has everyone just decided it is? It was a question that, on a gray morning in Denmark, was about to save a life. 2 lives, though she didn't know it yet. She had come to Denmark in the early spring, drifting upriver on a barge in exchange for 2 days of hauling, because she had heard there was work in the river city, dock work, warehouse work, the endless labor of a port. There was work, but not for her. The dock guilds had closed their rolls to clan the screenskins after a dispute the previous summer, and the warehouses wanted bonded labor, which was a polite city word for slaves, and the one tannery in Denmark had a full crew. So Vera had done what she always did, which was to make herself small and watchful, and find the margins of the place. And the margins of Denmark, she discovered, ran along the edge of the slave market. She hated the slave market. Of course she hated it. She had spent her whole life running from the thing the slave market existed to do. But the slave market in Denmark was not only a place where people were sold. It was also, like all such places, a kind of vast informal junkyard. Because the trade in living beings generated an enormous trade in dead things. The chains and the cages and the wagons and the manacles and the iron and the timber and the rope. All the apparatus of the trade, which wore out and broke and was discarded and resold and scavenged at the back lots and the breakers' yards that clustered around the market's edge like flies around a wound. And in those back lots, sometimes, a clanless orc with sharp eyes and quick hands could find work, or find scrap to sell, or find, once memorably, a half-rotted leather coat that had kept her alive through the previous winter. So she went to the back lots, and in the back lots, on that grey morning, she found the wagon. It sat at the very rear of the lot, belonging to a slave trader and scrap dealer named Otho Bell, a fat, soft-spoken, dead-eyed man who dealt in the lower end of the trade. The broken stock, the sick, the old, the ones the big charter companies sold off cheap when they weren't worth the feed. Bell's lot was a graveyard of the trade's cast-offs, and the wagon was the worst thing in it. It was a cage wagon, the kind used to transport slaves in bulk. A heavy iron-barred box mounted on a timber bed, drawn by a team, with a barred door at the back and a driver's bench at the front. Or it had been that once. Now it was a ruin. 2 of the 4 wheels were broken, the iron tires rusted through and the spokes rotted. The timber bed was gray and split and furred with moss. The iron bars of the cage were a solid mass of rust, orange and flaking, fused in places into shapeless lumps. The roof of the cage had partly collapsed. Weeds grew up through the floor. It listed badly to one side where an axle had failed, and it had clearly been sitting exactly where it sat now for a very long time, sinking slowly into the mud of the lot, becoming part of the ground. It was, by any sane measure, worthless. Worse than worthless. It would cost more to haul away than the scrap was worth. Vera stood and looked at it for a long time. She did not know, at first, why she looked at it so long. There were other things in the lot worth more of her attention: a coil of good rope, a stack of iron manacles that the breakers would buy by weight, a leather harness that was nearly whole. The wagon was the one thing in the lot with no value at all. And yet she stood in front of it in the gray morning light, and she felt the old, patient attention come over her, the question rising in the back of her mind the way it always did. But is it actually dead? Or has everyone just decided it is? Later, when she tried to explain it, and there would come a day, years later, when she would try to explain it to someone who needed to understand, she would say that it was the smell. Not the smell of rot and rust and old mud, which was the smell the whole lot wore like a skin. Underneath that, faint, almost gone, was another smell. The smell of something living. Something that breathed. It was so faint that her conscious mind never registered it as a thought, only as a feeling. A prickling at the back of the neck, the marsh instinct her grandmother had drilled into her in the crawl space above the black water. Be still. Be small. Listen. Something is here that the others have not seen. She walked the length of the wagon slowly. She put her hand on the rusted bars. She crouched and looked underneath at the rotted timber bed. And there she saw the thing that made her certain, though she could not yet have said certain of what. The bed of the wagon was too thick. A cage wagon's bed was a simple timber platform, a hand's breadth of plank. This one was deep, 2 handbreadths, perhaps more, and along the underside, almost invisible under the moss and the grime, ran a line. A seam. The faint, deliberate edge of a panel that had been built to open. A false floor. Vera had spent her whole childhood in a crawl space built into the floor of a longhouse. She knew, in her bones, in the deepest part of herself, exactly what a false floor was for. It was a place to hide what you could not afford to lose. A place to put the thing you meant to keep safe when the boots and the chains came up the channel in the gray light. A place for the still, the small, the silent. A place for the one you hoped they would pass over and not see. She stood up. Her heart was beating hard. She made her face flat and empty, the market face she had worn for 5 years, and she walked across the lot to where Otho Bell sat on a stool in the doorway of his shack, picking his teeth with a sliver of bone. "The cage wagon," she said in the careful river tongue. "At the back. How much?" Bell looked at her with his dead eyes and laughed. A soft, wet laugh with no humor in it. "That heap? You want that heap?" He shook his head. "Greenskin. I've been trying to get rid of that thing for a year. It's not worth the haul. Tell you what. You want it, you can have it, if you swear by whatever you greenskins swear by, to haul it off my lot within the week. It's an eyesore. It's bad luck. 2 of my buyers won't come past it." He grinned, showing gray teeth. "They say it's haunted. Say they hear things from it at night." The prickling at the back of Vera's neck became a cold certainty that ran all the way down her spine. They hear things from it at night. She kept her market face. "I don't take a thing for free," she said. It was true, in its way. A clanless orc who took charity put herself in debt, and debt to a slave trader was a short road to a chain. But it was also that she needed Bell to think of this as a sale, a closed transaction, a thing concluded and forgotten. She did not want him thinking about that wagon ever again. She did not want him remembering it or wondering about it or sending one of his men to look it over before it left. She wanted it bought and paid for and gone from his mind. She reached into the inside pocket of her coat and took out the bone. It was a finger bone, human or orc, she had never been sure, polished smooth by years in her pocket, the last thing she owned that had belonged to her grandmother. The old woman had carried it her whole life and never said where it came from, and when she died, Vera had taken it because it was the only thing in the longhouse that was small enough to carry and meant anything at all. It was not valuable. It was not even strictly currency. But in the back lots of a slave market, where the breakers paid for bone by the basket, for buttons, for glue, for the bone meal the city gardens wanted, a single polished finger bone was a coin like any other. A small coin. The smallest coin there was. "1 bone," she said, and held it out on her flat green palm. Otho Bell looked at the bone. He looked at the orc girl. And then he laughed again, that soft, wet laugh. And he took the bone off her palm with 2 fat fingers and dropped it into the pouch at his belt. And he said, "Sold, to the green skin with no sense. Out of my lot by week's end, or I'll have my boys break it for scrap and bill you for the labour." And he went back to picking his teeth. And as far as Otho Bell was concerned, the transaction was complete. The wagon was forgotten, and the morning went on. Vera walked back across the lot to the wagon she now owned, the only thing in the world she owned. She had spent her last coin, her grandmother's bone, the final fragment of the Ashven greenskins, on a rotted cage on 4 broken wheels in the mud of a slave market. She crouched again by the false floor, and she put her mouth close to the seam, and in the old marsh tongue of the Ashven, the tongue no one living spoke any more but her, she whispered, "I see you. Be still a little longer. I'm going to get you out." And from inside the false floor, so faint she felt it more than heard it, something answered. A single, small, exhausted tap. Knuckle on wood. The sound of something still alive, that had given up on being found, hearing itself be found. That was the morning everything changed. She could not open it there. That was the first hard truth, and she made herself face it fully, crouched in the mud with her heart hammering. She could not pry up a false floor in the middle of Otho Bell's lot, in the open, a stone's throw from the slave market, with Bell himself sitting in his doorway and a dozen of his men coming and going. Whatever was sealed in that wagon was sealed there for a reason, and the reason had a price on it. And the moment Vera exposed it, she exposed both of them. A clanless orc and a hidden, illegal, unregistered something in the heart of the trade, surrounded by the very people who profited from the trade. They would not survive the hour. So she did the hardest thing, which was to wait, to be still, to be small, to be silent. The lesson of the crawl space, the only inheritance her grandmother had left her besides the bone, and the bone was gone now, spent. So the lesson was all she had. She forced herself to stand up slowly, to stretch as if her back ached from crouching, to wander off across the lot and price the coil of rope and haggle over the manacles. To be exactly the thing Bell expected, a desperate, clanless scavenger, scraping a living from the edges, of no interest to anyone. And all the while her mind was working, fast and cold and clear, on the problem of how to move a half-collapsed cage wagon 14 miles out of the city to the only place she knew where she could open it in safety. An abandoned mill house on the Dren River, downstream of the city, in a flooded backwater the river had reclaimed, where no one went because the bridge was out and the road was drowned, and there was nothing there worth the trouble of getting to. It took her 3 days, 3 days of work that nearly killed her. She had no team to draw the wagon and no coin to hire one, so she did it herself, by hand, the way she had learned to do impossible physical things on the trail crews and in the tanning pits and the grave fields of the human cities. Slowly, methodically, by breaking the impossible thing into 100 merely brutal things and doing them one at a time. She scavenged 2 cracked but serviceable wheels from the breaker's yard, trading a day's labor scraping rust for them. She jacked the wagon up out of the mud with a lever and a fulcrum of stacked timber, working through a whole freezing night so that no one would see, replacing the broken wheels one at a time, packing the failed axle with a splint of green wood lashed with the good rope she'd haggled for. And then, on the third night, with the wagon barely rolling and listing and groaning on its ruined frame, she put a rope harness over her own shoulders, and she pulled. She pulled it out of Belle's lot in the dead hour before dawn. She pulled it through the sleeping streets of Drenmark, hauling like a draft animal, the wagon creaking and shrieking behind her, so that she froze at every sound and waited, heart pounding, for a window to open or a voice to call out. And none ever did. Because the only people awake in a river city at that hour are the ones with reasons not to look. She pulled it out the river gate, past the bored guard who took one look at the rotted heap and the exhausted greenskin, and waved her through with a curse. Because who would steal that? And who would smuggle anything in that? And what did he care where a clanless orc dragged her garbage? She pulled it down the drowned river road in the grey of the false dawn, the wagon sinking to its hubs in the mud, and she put her whole body into the rope and she pulled. And somewhere out there on the dark road, sometime in those 3 days, she had stopped thinking of the thing in the wagon as a problem to be solved, and started thinking of it as a person to be saved. Though she still did not know who, or what, or why. And the whole time, from inside the false floor, came the tapping. Knuckle on wood. Faint and then fainter. And then, for one terrible stretch in the last mile, when the wagon was bogged to the axles and Vera was sobbing into the rope and pulling with everything she had left, nothing at all. Silence. And she had thought, I'm too late. I'm too slow. It's the same as always. I'm the one who got away, and everyone else dies. And then, just as she got the wagon up onto the firm ground by the mill house, just as the sky was going from gray to the first pale gold of true dawn, the tapping came again. Weak, barely there, but there. Alive. She got the wagon into the shelter of the ruined mill house, out of sight of the river and the road, and then, finally, in the long-awaited safety of that drowned and forgotten place, with the morning light slanting in through the broken roof and the river murmuring past outside, Vera of the Ashfen Greenskins took up the iron pry bar she had carried for 3 days for exactly this purpose, and she opened the false floor of the wagon she had bought for a single bone. The panel came up with a shriek of rusted nails and a gust of foul air, the smell of long confinement, of a body that had lived too long in a space too small. And in the crawl space beneath, curled into a space barely large enough to hold her, lay a child. An orc child. A girl. She could not have been more than 9 years old, and she was the most wretched thing Vera had ever seen. And Vera had seen the marsh burn. The child was filthy and starved, her green skin gone gray and slack over her bones, her eyes huge in a hollow face, her small wrists ringed with old iron and older scars. She was chained, a short, heavy chain, bolted to a ring set into the false floor, looped through an iron collar around her neck. She had been chained into that crawl space and sealed beneath the floor and left. And by the look of her, she had been there for weeks, surviving on what little air came through the seams and what little water and scraps someone, at some point, had passed down to her, and then had stopped passing. The child looked up at Vera with those huge eyes. She did not flinch. She did not beg. She had gone somewhere past flinching and begging, into the still, small, silent place that Vera knew better than she knew anything in the world. The place you go when there is nothing left to do but be still and wait to be found, or wait to die, and you no longer much care which. And then the child spoke. Her voice was a cracked whisper, and she spoke not in the river tongue, not in the trade cant of the slave markets, but in the old marsh tongue, the tongue of the fens, the tongue no one living spoke any more but Vera. And the words she spoke were the oldest words the Ashfen had, the words you spoke to another of your own kind when you met them in the wide and dangerous world, and needed to know, before anything else, whether you had found kin or enemy. "Whose are you?" It was the question every Ashfen child learned before they learned anything else. Whose are you? Not who are you. The Ashfen did not believe a person was anything alone. But whose? To what clan, what longhouse, what stretch of black water and stilted home do you belong? Tell me whose you are, and I will know whether to trust you. Vera knelt down in the dark of the crawlspace, and she felt something break open in her chest that had been sealed shut, like a false floor, for 5 long years. And she answered in the same tongue, the words coming up out of the deepest part of her, out of the longhouse and the moss light and her grandmother's hand over her mouth. Ashfen. I am Ashfen, the last of the Ashfen. And you? The child's huge eyes filled slowly with tears. The first tears, Vera would later learn, that she had let herself cry in longer than she could remember. Ashfen, the child whispered back. My mother was Ashfen. She told me, before they took her. She made me learn the words. She said if I ever met one of our own, I should ask. She said we were almost all gone. She said there might be no one left to answer. The tears spilled over, cutting tracks through the filth on her face. But you answered. And Vera, who had spent 5 years believing she was the last of her people, the sole survivor, the one who got away while everyone else died. Vera understood, kneeling in the dark of a crawlspace beneath a wagon she had bought for 1 bone, that she had been wrong. She was not the last. There had been a child. There had been, somewhere out there in the marsh in those last seasons, an Ashfen woman who had borne a daughter and taught her the words, and then been taken by the charters and sold down the long, dark map of the human cities. And the daughter had been taken too, and traded down and down through the lower ends of the trade, the broken stock, the cheap stock, until she ended in the hands of a man like Otho Bell, who had no use for a half-dead orc child too small to work, except one. There was always one use. The lower trade had its specialties, its quiet appetites, its buyers who wanted small and silent things for reasons that did not bear thinking about. And the false floor of the wagon was a hiding place, yes, but it was not the child's hiding place. It was Bell's. He had hidden her there, illegal, unregistered, off the books, the kind of stock you did not display in the open market, to be sold quietly to a particular kind of buyer when the right one came along. And he had kept her sealed in the dark to keep her hidden, and he had nearly forgotten her there, the way he had nearly forgotten the wagon itself, the way the marsh forgets a drowned thing under the black water. Until a clanless orc with 1 bone and a marsh instinct for the still and the small and the silent had walked into the back of his lot and asked, "But is it actually dead? Or has everyone just decided it is?" Her name was Mira. That was what her mother had called her, the child said. A marsh name, an Ashfen name, meaning, in the old tongue, the still water that runs deep. And as Vera worked at the iron collar with her pry bar and her tools, breaking the rusted bolt that held the chain, as she lifted the child, who weighed almost nothing, who was all bone and hollow and huge dark eyes, out of the crawl space and into the light of the broken mill house for the first time in weeks, she made a vow. Not aloud. The Ashven did not make vows aloud. They believed a thing said aloud was a thing half given to the world, and the world was a thief. She made it in the still, small, silent place inside her, the place her grandmother had taught her to keep safe. You will not be taken, not while I live. Whatever it costs, whatever I have to do, you are mine to keep now, the way the longhouse was mine, the way the crawl space was mine. And I have learned, the hard way, the only way there is. I do not let go of the things I have decided to keep. The first days were a war fought against the child's own body. Mira was so far gone with hunger and confinement that food itself was dangerous. Vera knew this from the grave fields, where the starved often died not of starvation, but of eating, their wasted bodies unable to bear the shock of a full meal. So she fed the child the way you feed the dying back to life, slowly, in tiny amounts. Broth first, made from river fish she caught in the mill race, and a few wild roots and the inner bark of trees, the marsh foods, the famine foods, the foods the Ashven had eaten in hard winters for 9 generations. She fed her by the spoonful, hour by hour, day and night, and she watched the child's body fight its way back from the edge, the gray draining slowly out of the green skin, the huge eyes losing a little of their hollow, the small hands learning to hold a spoon again instead of being held. The mill house became their longhouse. Vera cleared the driest corner of the broken structure and built a nest of every scrap of cloth and reed and dry grass she could gather. She rigged a fish trap in the mill race and caught eel and trout. She found, in the flooded land around the mill house, the familiar plants of her childhood: cattail and arrowhead, watercress and wild onion, the edible roots and shoots that the marsh provided to those who knew how to ask. She built a small fire each night in the old mill house hearth, screened so its light would not show from the river road, and she cooked, and the two of them ate, and slowly, the child came back, and as the child's body healed, her voice returned, and with her voice, her story, told in fragments over many nights in the old marsh tongue. The two of them passing the language back and forth like a fire passed from hearth to hearth, keeping it alive between them, the last two speakers of a dying tongue. Mira had been born in the marsh, in the last years, in a longhouse Vera half remembered from the far end of the fen. Her mother had hidden her, as Vera's grandmother had hidden Vera, in crawl spaces and reed beds and the black water. Be still, be small, be silent. And for a while it had worked. And then it had not. Mira had been 5 when the charters took her mother. She remembered the boat. She remembered being pulled away by a hand that was not her mother's. She remembered the long, dark years after, passed down through the trade, sold and resold, used for the small hard labors that small hands could do, learning the only lesson the trade ever taught, which was the lesson Vera had learned too. That she was not a person, but a resource. Not a whose, but a what. A thing that could be bought for a bone and sealed beneath a floor and forgotten. But she had not forgotten the words. Her mother had made her learn the words. If you ever meet one of our own. And she had carried the words through all of it. The one thing no trader could take or sell or seal beneath a floor. The one thing that was hers. And in the end, the words had been true. She had met one of her own. She had asked, and someone had answered. There was one night, early on, that Vera would remember for the rest of her life. Mira had been with her perhaps 10 days, and the worst of the danger had passed. The child could hold down solid food now, could sit up, could walk a few unsteady steps along the millhouse wall. But the nights were the hard part. The nights were when the trade came back. Mira would wake screaming from dreams she could not or would not describe, her small body rigid, her hands clawing at the iron collar that was no longer there. And Vera would hold her through it, hour after hour, saying the only thing she knew to say, the old marsh words, over and over, until the child came back from wherever the dream had taken her. On this particular night, when the screaming had finally passed, and the child lay spent and shaking against her, Mira asked, in the smallest voice Vera had ever heard, "When are you going to sell me?" It was not an accusation. That was the thing that broke Vera. It was not even a fear, quite. It was simply a question, asked the way you ask about the weather. Because in the whole of Mira's short life, every single person who had ever fed her or sheltered her or shown her any kindness at all had done so for exactly one reason, which was to keep her alive and whole and worth a higher price. Kindness, in Mira's experience, was a thing that came before a sale. It always had. There was no version of the world the child had ever encountered in which someone fed you broth by the spoonful through the night and did not, at the end of it, intend to sell you to someone else. She was not afraid of being sold. She had made her peace with being sold long ago. She only wanted to know when, so that she could be ready, so that she could begin the work of going still and small and silent inside herself, the way you do before a thing you cannot stop. Vera held the child a little tighter, and she looked into the dark of the broken mill house, and she found she could not speak for a moment because of the thing that had risen up in her throat. And then she said, in the old tongue, very slowly, so that there could be no mistaking it, "Never. Do you hear me, Mira? Never. There is no one I am keeping you for. There is no buyer. There is no sale. I did not pull you out of the dark to put you back into it. You are not a thing I am holding until someone better comes along. You are the someone better. You are the thing itself. I spent the last bone I owned in all the world on a wagon that I bought because I thought there might be a person inside it. And there was. And that person is you. And I would spend it again. I would spend 1,000 bones. I would spend everything I have ever had or ever will have, and it would still be the best trade I ever made. You are not for sale. You were never for sale. You are kept." The child was quiet for a long time after that. Vera thought she had fallen asleep. And then, in the dark, Mira said one word, not in the marsh tongue, not in any tongue Vera had taught her, but in a small private word the child must have made up for herself, somewhere in the long dark years of the trade. A word for a thing she had never had, and had no proper name for. And Vera understood that the word meant something like mine, or something like home, or something like safe, and that the child had given it to her, was calling her by it, the way you name a thing you have decided to keep. And Vera, who had not wept when the marsh burned, and had not wept in 5 years of grave fields and tanning pits and the long, cold map of the human cities, wept then, silently, in the dark, with the child's small head heavy on her shoulder, and the river moving past outside, and the old tongue and the new word holding the two of them together, against everything the world had ever done to either of them. Vera had thought, for 5 years, that being the last of the Ashven meant the Ashven were over. That a people is a thing that ends when the last one standing falls. But sitting by the fire in the mill house, with Mira's small head heavy against her shoulder, and the old tongue moving between them in the dark, she understood something she had not understood before, something that went down to the root of everything her grandmother had ever tried to teach her. A people is not a number. A people is a thing you carry and pass on. The Ashven had survived for 9 generations, not because they were many or strong, but because each generation had taught the next how to be still and small and silent, how to find value in what others threw away, how to ask, "Whose are you?" and how to answer. The Ashven were not over. The Ashven were 2 now, where she had thought there was 1. And 2, she was learning, was not half of nothing. 2 was the whole world, made new. But the world outside the mill house had not stopped, and the trade does not forget forever. It was the better part of a month before Otho Bell remembered the wagon. He remembered it the way you remember a debt or an itch, slowly, then all at once. He had sold a rotted cage wagon to a clanless greenskin for a bone, a transaction so trivial he had forgotten it before the orc was out of his lot. But there had been a buyer coming, a particular buyer, a quiet man from upriver who came twice a year to Bell's lot and asked, in a low voice, whether Bell had anything small and off the books, and who paid in good silver for the kind of stock that did not appear in any market and left no record behind. Bell had been holding the child for this buyer. He'd sealed her beneath the floor of a wagon precisely because the wagon was worthless, an eyesore at the back of the lot that no one would look at twice. The perfect place to hide a thing you meant to sell quietly. And then the buyer's visit had been delayed, and the weeks had passed, and Bell, fat and soft and dead-eyed, with 100 transactions a week and a memory like a sieve for anything that wasn't immediately profitable, had let it slip his mind that the wagon he'd given away for a bone had a child sealed inside it. When the buyer finally came and asked his low, quiet question, and Bell turned to fetch his special stock, the memory came back all at once, and with it, a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the loss of the child, and everything to do with the loss of the silver. He had sold his most valuable piece of hidden stock to a clanless scavenger for the price of a coin. And worse, far worse, that scavenger now possessed proof. The child was proof. Proof that Otho Bell dealt in unregistered, illegal, off-the-books stock. Proof that he sold to the quiet buyers from upriver. Proof of 100 crimes that the city council, which licensed the legal trade and was paid handsomely to look the other way at the rest, would nonetheless be forced to notice if they were rubbed in its face. A clanless orc was nothing. But a clanless orc with proof was a knife at Otho Bell's fat throat. He had to get the child back, and he had to make the orc disappear. He sent his men first to the obvious places, the back lots, the breakers' yards, the dock slums where clanless greenskins clustered. But Vera had vanished. No one had seen her. The wagon was gone, dragged off in the night, and the only lead was the bored guard at the river gate who remembered, when Bell's man pressed a coin into his hand, a greenskin hauling a rotted heap out the drowned river road a month back, out toward the dead mill houses, out toward the flooded land where no one went. Vera felt it before she knew it, the marsh instinct, the prickling at the back of the neck. She had been free in the mill house for 3 weeks, long enough to begin, dangerously, to feel safe. And the day she felt the prickling return was the day she knew safety had been a story she'd let herself believe. She was at the fish trap in the mill race at grey dawn when she saw it. Far off down the river road, where the drowned road met the firm ground, the shapes of men, 4 of them, moving slow, searching, looking at the dead mill houses one by one. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury, like wanting, like choosing. She went back to the mill house, fast and silent, and she woke Mira, who came awake instantly, fully, the way the trade raised come awake, already afraid. And she said in the old tongue the words that needed no explanation. "They've come. Be still. Be small. Be silent. Do exactly as I say." And then she made the second hard choice of that long season. The choice that would decide everything. She could run. She knew how to run. Running was the thing she was best at in all the world, the skill that had kept her alive when everyone else died. She could take the child and slip out the back of the mill house into the flooded land and vanish into the marsh country, the way she had vanished from the burning of the ash fen. And the men would find an empty ruin and a cold fire, and nothing else. Running would work. Running always worked, for her. But running was the thing that had made her hate herself for 5 years. Running was the still, small, silent crawl space, and her mother poled away down the channel into the grey, while Vera watched and did nothing. Running saved the one who ran and abandoned everyone else. And she understood, in the cold, clear dawn with the men coming up the river road, that if she ran now, even with the child, even saving the child, she would be running for the rest of her life. Belle would not stop. The trade did not stop. A clanless orc and an off-the-books child would be hunted from city to city down the whole long map, until one day she was too slow, or too tired, or too unlucky, and the running would end the way running always ends. Unless she made it end here. Unless she stopped being the still, small, silent thing that hides beneath the floor and waits to be passed over, and became, instead, the thing the trade had never once had to reckon with. Prey that had decided to stop being prey. So she did not run. She stayed, and she made a plan. And the plan was built out of everything the marsh and the cities had taught her. The stillness, the smallness, the silence, the patient attention, the genius for the overlooked space and the unasked question. The mill house was a ruin, but a ruin is a thing Vera understood better than anyone alive. She had spent her life finding the parts of ruined things that still worked. The old mill had a sluice gate, rusted but sound, that controlled the mill race, and behind it a head of water held back by the dam, a great cold weight of the Dren River, waiting. The flooded land around the mill house was a maze of channels and sinks and false ground that looked solid and was not, the kind of treacherous marsh terrain that the ash fen had used for 9 generations to swallow the boots and the boats of those who came hunting. And the wagon, the rotted cage wagon she had bought for a bone, still sat in the shelter of the mill house. And a cage, Vera reflected, is a thing that works in both directions. A cage keeps a thing in. A cage also keeps a thing in. She hid Mira first, and she hid her well, in a place Otho Bell's men would never find, because it was the one place in all the world built by the ash fen for exactly this purpose. Not the wagon's false floor, which Bell's men would think to check, but a hide Vera had made herself in her first week at the mill house, dug into the riverbank beneath the roots of an old willow, screened with reed and mud, ventilated through a hollow cattail stem, a crawl space in the deep marsh tradition, invisible to anyone who did not know the marsh. "Be still," she told the child, sealing her in. Be small. Be silent. Whatever you hear, do not come out. I will come for you. I always will, now. That is what whose are you means. It means I will always come. And the child, who had spent her whole life being sealed into dark places by people who meant her harm, looked up at the orc, who was sealing her into a dark place to keep her safe, and understood the difference, and was still. Then Vera went to meet the men. She did not meet them as prey. She met them on her own ground, the drowned ground, the marsh maze she had spent 3 weeks learning the way her people learned their home channels. Every sink, every false bank, every place the firm ground gave way to black water and sucking mud. She let them see her. That was the whole art of it, the art her grandmother had only ever taught in reverse. She had been taught all her life how not to be seen, and now she turned the lesson inside out and made herself seen exactly when and where she chose. She showed herself at the edge of the millhouse clearing, a single, clanless orc, apparently alone, apparently frightened, and she let the men see her bolt into the flooded land, along a path that looked, to a city man's eye, like the obvious way out, and was, in fact, the way in, the way down, the way into the marsh's patient, hungry dark. They came after her, because hunters always come after prey that runs. 4 men, armed, sure of themselves, contemptuous of a single, fleeing greenskin. And the marsh took them the way the marsh had always taken those who came hunting the ash fen. Not all at once, but one at a time. The first went into a sink to his waist within 50 paces, floundering and cursing, dropping his blade in the black water. The second, doubling back along what he thought was firm ground, found it was not, and went down screaming into a channel that the mill race fed, where the cold current took his legs out from under him. The remaining 2, frightened now, no longer hunters, but men lost in a drowned land with the grey light failing, and a green shape flickering at the edge of sight, did the thing that lost and frightened men do, which was to make for the one solid landmark they could see, the millhouse, the shelter, the dry ground. The wagon. Vera was waiting for them at the sluice gate. She let them get into the millhouse. She let them get to the wagon, the rotted cage wagon, where in their panic and their certainty they did the thing she had counted on them doing. They took shelter in it. The one solid iron-barred structure in a collapsing ruin, the one place that felt safe. And the moment they were both inside the cage, Vera came out of the shadow where she had been still and small and silent, and she swung the barred door shut, and she dropped the iron pin she had freed and oiled 3 days before, and the cage that had held the starved child for a month held 2 armed men of the slave trade, locked in, caught, prey. And then she opened the sluice gate. The head of water behind the old dam, the great cold weight of the Dren River that the mill had held back for 100 years, came down through the mill race in a roar, and Vera had aimed it the way her people aimed the marsh, and it took the wagon, the rotted, half-floating, barely mended cage wagon, and lifted it off its broken wheels and swept it out of the millhouse and down the mill race and into the deep, cold channel of the river. The 2 men inside it screaming and clutching the bars, riding their cage out into the dark water, exactly as the child had been meant to ride hers. Vera did not watch them drown. She did not, in the end, intend that they should drown. The channel ran to a shallows 1/2 mile down, where the wagon would ground, and the men, if they were quick and frightened enough, could break out and crawl to shore and run all the way back to Otho Bell to tell him what the drowned land did to those who hunted in it. She wanted them alive, in fact. She wanted them to carry the story. Because the story was the weapon. The story was the proof. Vera had learned, in 5 years in the human world, the one thing that frightened a man like Otho Bell more than any blade. The truth, spoken in the wrong place to the wrong ears. And so she did not flee with the child into the deep marsh, the way her old self would have. She did the opposite. She went, with the child, back into the city, back into Drenmark, into the heart of the trade. But she went as the one thing the trade had no answer for. Not a clanless scavenger, not an off-the-books resource. She went as a witness, with a witness, carrying proof. The child, Mira, alive and recovered and able to speak. The iron collar with Bell's own brand stamped into it, and the testimony of 2 men who had hunted an orc through a drowned land and lived to be afraid. She did not go to the city council, who were paid to look away. She was not naive. The council that licensed the trade would never break the trade for the sake of one clanless orc and one off-the-books child. She went instead to the trade's own enemies. For every trade has enemies, the abolition speakers and the temple charities and the rival merchants who resented the charter company's monopoly and the pamphlet printers who would sell any scandal that sold. She went to the people who wanted, for their own 1,000 different reasons, a stick to beat the slave charters with, and she put into their hands the best stick there was. A true story, with a living child at the center of it, of a licensed trader dealing in sealed and hidden and illegal stock, sold off the books to quiet buyers from upriver for purposes that did not bear the daylight. The story traveled. Stories do. It traveled the way her own story would one day travel, across borders, into homes, farther than anyone hauling it could have imagined. It did not bring down the trade, one story never does, but it brought down Otho Bell. The council, forced at last to notice what it had long been paid to ignore, could not be seen to ignore a thing that had become a public scandal, a thing printed in pamphlets and shouted in temple squares. Bell's charter was revoked. His lot was seized. His quiet buyer from upriver, named at last in a printed sheet, fled the river country and was not seen again. And the child who had been sealed beneath a floor to be sold in the dark became instead the face of a story that a great many people, for a great many reasons, found it convenient to repeat, which meant she became a thing the trade could never again touch, because she was watched now, known, remembered, the opposite of still and small and silent. Vera and Mira did not stay in Drenmark. The city had served its purpose, and the city was not home. When it was over, when Bell was finished and the story was loose in the world and could no longer be stopped, the 2 of them went south, downriver and then overland, back toward the marsh country, back toward the fenlands south of the iron reaches, where the black water moved through the reeds and the long houses stood on their stilts, empty now, silent now, waiting. The Ashfen Marsh was not empty for long. They went back, the 2 of them, the last 2 speakers of the old tongue, the last 2 who knew how to ask, "Whose are you?" and how to answer. They found a longhouse at the far end of the fen that the charters had not burned, only abandoned, its stilts sound and its reed roof half fallen, and they did what Vera had spent her whole life learning to do. They took the thing everyone else had given up on, and they found the parts of it that still worked, and they made it home. Vera repaired the stilts and rethatched the roof and set the fish traps in the old channels her grandmother had fished. She taught Mira the marsh, the edible plants, the hidden ways, the reading of the black water, all the 9-generation knowledge that had been sealed inside Vera like a thing beneath a false floor, and that now, at last, had someone to be passed to. And the moss grew back, the strange, luminous moss that grew only in the Ashfen Marsh, and at night the longhouse glowed soft and green the way it had when Vera was a child
and a grandmother held a hand over her mouth in the dark.
Others came, in time. That was the thing Vera had not expected, the thing that taught her the last lesson. She had thought she and Mira were the only two left, but the story had traveled, and stories find their own. Over the seasons, in ones and twos, others came up the channels into the Ashfen Marsh, clanless greenskins, freed and escaped and cast off, orcs who had been resources and not people, who had heard, somewhere down the long map of the human cities, that there was a place in the southern fens where one of the marsh clans had come back to life, where a green woman would look at a broken and discarded thing and ask whether it was actually dead or whether everyone had only decided it was. They came the way Vera had once scavenged the back lots, looking for the overlooked place, the unwanted ground, the home that nobody else wanted because wanting was a privilege they had never had. And Vera took them in, every one, and asked them the old question, "Whose are you?" and taught them the answer. Ashfen. You are Ashfen now. We are the ones who were thrown away and would not stay thrown away. We are the still water that runs deep. Be still when you must, and small when you must, and silent when you must. But know that you are kept now, and you are home, and no one will ever seal you beneath a floor and forget you, because we do not let go of the things we have decided to keep. Years later, many years, when the Ashfen Marsh held 40 longhouses again, and the channels were thick with fish traps, and the moss light glowed across the fen on summer nights like a fallen piece of the sky, a young orc who had come up the channel only the week before, half-starved and silent and afraid, the way they all came, asked Vera why. Why she did it. Why she took them all in. The broken ones, the thrown-away ones, the ones the world had decided were not worth the haul. And Vera, who was not young anymore, who had tusks gone gray at the tips and a long house full of the people she had decided to keep, thought about how to answer. She thought about a gray morning in a slave market and a rotted cage wagon at the back of a lot, and a question that no one else had bothered to ask. She thought about a finger bone, polished smooth, the last of her grandmother, spent on a thing everyone else had given up for dead. She thought about a false floor and a faint tapping, knuckle on wood, the sound of something still alive that had given up on being found, hearing itself be found. She thought about a child's cracked whisper in the old tongue. "Whose are you?" And the thing that had broken open in her chest, the sealed thing, the false floor of her own heart coming up at last after 5 years to let the light in. "Because someone bought me for a bone once," she said, though it was not quite true and was truer than the truth. Someone looked at a thing the whole world had thrown away and did not see junk, and did not see ruin, and did not see a resource. They saw a person, sealed beneath a floor, still alive, still waiting to be found. And they spent everything they had, which was almost nothing, which was one small coin, one last bone, to open the floor and let the light in. She looked out across the marsh, at the longhouses on their stilts and the moss light coming up green in the dusk, and the new young orc beside her, half-starved and silent and afraid, and home. "The world will tell you that you are not worth the haul," she said. "The world will seal you in the dark and forget you, and call it your own fault for being small. Do not believe it. There is always someone willing to spend their last bone on the thing the world threw away. I know because I was that thing, and I know because I became that someone. And so will you, child. So will you. She had been 21 years old and homeless, and she had owned exactly one thing in all the world: a single bone, the last of a vanished people. She had spent it on a rotted cage in the mud of a slave market that everyone else had refused to touch. And what was inside that wagon had not just changed her life. It had given her back her people, given her a daughter, given her a reason, given her a home, given her, in the end, against everything the world had ever taught her to expect, a future. It was the best bone she ever spent. It was the only thing she ever bought that turned out to be worth more than the whole world she'd been thrown out of. If this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who has ever felt thrown away, overlooked, sealed beneath a floor and forgotten. And tell us in the comments, have you ever found something precious in a thing the world had given up on? Or have you ever been that precious thing yourself, waiting to be found? We'd love to hear your story. We always do. See you in the next one.